Good evening, everyone. I am Haley Shipp, and I am the Communications Director with the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance and serving as the Master of Ceremonies, if you will, for this Rural Resilience webinar series. Sixth year that we've had this series. So some folks have been with us previously. Some folks, this might be your first route through this. Basically, what we do within the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance is that we have two major programs, conservation and education. Being as we have a lot more nighttime hours this time of year than daylight, it's when we really double down on education. We have hired this year Mary Oxart. She is our education program manager, and you'll see that reflected in the offerings that we do have for RSA as far as education goes. Now, you can always go to our website, ranchstewards.org/events. That'll give you an idea of what is coming up, and that's where you can get signed up for everything, including the webinars like this, which you're already here for, which also have to say thank you for that. We now have captured your email address, and you are part of our newsletter, which is also a great place to get information about what is upcoming. So Rural Resilience, this webinar series is in its sixth year. That means we started it during the COVID time, and it was actually a bit ahead of its time at that point because people were just really scrounging to figure out how do we now connect with the people in our communities when we know that we're kind of locked at home. But you know what? For rural America, being locked at home, that's not anything that's all that abstract for us. And so this mechanism worked at that time, and it's continued to work for us. And we're excited to now expand some of our virtual offerings. We had our first ever virtual classroom earlier this year called Mapping with Meta. That's all about if you wanted to put together a map for your ranch, how you go through and do that using some of the free resources that are available online on your phone, and really get that whole map put together for the ranch that you've always intended on. Maybe you have an old plat book that it's all highlighted in, but getting it into digital format. If you want to head on over to our YouTube channel, that's just youtube.com/Ranchers Stewardship Alliance. You can watch a replay of that Mapping with Meta series and get a feel for what that's about. Coming up next week, we actually have a one-stop shop for ranch succession planning. We're calling it our Lunch and Learn. It's okay for lunch and learn if you're doing lunch just a little bit later in the day, 1 o'clock to 2:30 p.m. Mountain Time. And we've got three professionals in the ranch succession, business succession, farm succession, all of the successions sitting with us on that panel. So Kurt Barnikoff out of Havre, Montana. A lot of folks know Kurt. He's coming out of retirement. He's a retired CPA after 40 years in the industry, and he is going to be sitting on the panel to answer some of your questions. Also, Ariel Overstreet Adkins. She is an attorney who really has a soft spot in her heart for making sure that ranch legacies and agricultural legacies continue. And then Brent Turner. He is a financial advisor and also an author. He just released this book. It's called Piece of Land, which was part of our RSA Winter Book Club. We discussed this one, and he's going to be sitting on that panel as well. So it's coming up Monday, February 23rd, ranchstewards.org/events, and you can get all of the details. But that is not why you joined us tonight. So with no further ado, we're going to start talking about what tonight's discussion is all about. And this is about ranch water and really utilizing low-tech but high-impact strategies to restore ranch water. And we all know that it's throughout the northern Great Plains, a very arid region, and water is precious. And so why not do everything that we can to really try to capture more of the limited amounts that we get? With us leading that discussion today is Paul Jones. Paul began with the Colorado Division of Wildlife in 1992 as a district wildlife manager in Littleton, later transferring to Gunnison East in 1995, where he joined the pioneering Gunnison sage-grouse working group. In 2001, he became a habitat, later conservation biologist for Area 16, securing conservation easements, wildlife areas, and protecting over 15,000 acres of sage-grouse habitat, while helping to develop a CCAA covering 40 private ranches. In 2006, he moved to aquatic conservation biologist for the Southwest region, working on native fish and boreal toads until retiring in 2018, and he now runs, Paul, I should have asked you how to pronounce this. Tomichi or Tomichi? You can correct me. Creek Ecosystem Services, focusing on wet meadow and gully restoration. So with that, Paul, we'll go ahead and hand it over to you tonight.
Great. You guys can hear me, I assume?
Sounds perfect.
Wonderful. Yes, it's Tomichi Creek. It's a Ute word for mountain stream. Um, and it's a, I just want to say thanks for inviting me. I got to meet some of the folks in Malta earlier this summer. I'm super impressed with what RSC does, and it's an amazing program. You guys are really fortunate to have it, and I wish we had something like it here in Colorado. Um, I kind of packed a lot of information into a short period of time, so I'm going to jump into my slideshow here. And if you come up with any questions, just I think Haley's going to have you put them in the chat, and we'll try to get to those afterwards. And then later on, if you think of other questions as time goes by, my contact information is available. Um, uh, Through Haley and Mary, and feel free to reach out with any questions or anything later on as well. But with that, I think I will try to figure out how to share my screen really quickly here. And I believe, yes, that's it. Okay. Um, so, one of the first things to think about with meadows, and I think it took me a long time to figure this out, is that meadows are really alluvial features. They're basically floodplains, and they're formed by the deposition of sediments that's carried in water from areas of steeper gradient slopes. And then as water enters these lower gradient slopes, it deposits sediments onto these floodplains. Um, and This is a photograph I took this last summer after a lightning-caused wildfire just outside of Montrose, and it was during a monsoon storm. And you can see how these hill slopes look relatively dry, but all of that water that's collecting during this rainstorm is running off these hill slopes and spreading out over this valley, and all of that sediment is being deposited in that valley. Um, this is another example. This is on the Grand Mesa, west of Grand Junction, here in western Colorado. And this is actually a beaver dam. But again, you can see that all of these hill slopes are relatively dry, but the bottom is very, very moist. And even if that beaver dam wasn't there, this would be a very, very wet, seepy area. And so these are really, really important areas because they're the soils are very nutrient rich, and typically we have a higher water table in these settings. Um, so understanding how landscapes capture and store water is imperative to meadow management. And if we understand some basic concepts about water, we can take that information and incorporate it into our day-to-day management. And one of the most important things whenever you're working with stream restoration or meadow restoration is understanding the concept of bank full discharge. And bank full discharge is that maximum amount of discharge that a stream will convey. And so this arrow here in the center of the chart corresponds to this point in the cross section. And as water fills that channel, it's going to reach that bank full elevation, start spreading onto the floodplain, and that discharge arm starts to drop off. As that water gets onto the floodplain, it starts to recharge the shallow water aquifer. And This is an example of what it looks like. This is Tomichi Creek right outside of our place, and you can see that the water is just getting onto the floodplain. We're right at bank full stage in this photograph. And this event should occur every 1.5 to 2 years. Hydrologists expect us to see a bank full event in most normal stream settings every 1.5 to 2 years. Um, the other concept that's really important is that the energy associated with water when it comes to erosion and velocity discharge is a logarithmic relationship. It's not a linear relationship. And if we double the speed that water is flowing, we increase its erosive power by a factor of 8. And so what we end up with is this really rapid increasing energy arm. Now, I don't speak metric very well, so I took this information for a local system that I was working on, and I put it into something that I can understand, which is pounds per square inch and cubic feet per second. And for this particular stream, Spanish Gulch, um, a bank full event is right about 1 CFS. And interestingly enough, for this system, that 2 year flood is going to exert about 1 pound per square inch on the channel around it. Now, a 10-year flood is about 4 CFS, and we can see that the energy that that system is exerting is now about 16 pounds per square inch. A 50-year flood is about 8 CFS, and we're already up to 82 pounds per square inch. And then a 100-year flood is about 24 CFS, and now we're moving things that are weighing around 700 pounds or exerting a downward pressure of about 700 pounds per square inch. So fast moving water can carry a lot of sediment, but the opposite is also true. If we can break that energy arm, we can, as we slow water down, it will deposit tremendous amounts of sediment as well. And that's the whole process of what we're going to try and do is to try and slow water down and spread it out. For the same little gulch, I want to show a cross section that gives a representation of what bank full looks like. And so this is if we sliced the valley in half or lengthwise across the valley and looked at it. Here's our channel. It's, a little over a foot deep, maybe 9 feet wide. And so every year and a half or so, we should have water that gets onto the floodplain and drops down into that soil moisture profile, increasing our soil moisture profile. The problem with this setting is this is what the actual oops, cross section of the valley looks like. This red line is what our valley actually is, and this light blue line at the bottom is the cross sectional area of what the channel should be at bank full. So rather than having water gaining access to the floodplain every 2 years, this water is trapped down in the bottom of this little in this gully. Um, when we look at this darker blue line, this is where the 100-year flood is. And so in this channel, there's no way for this channel to heal itself. By the time we get enough water that it's getting onto the banks like it should, we have so much energy in this channel it continues to cut downwards and we just it continues to downcut and it'll never heal unless we intervene. Now the other important thing about bank full elevation is that it's also our water table. And so if we look at where our water table is now compared to where it used to be, in this example, we've lost about 6.3 feet of water table. And this has a huge impact when we look at the different species that we want to manage for. And on this particular property, the ranch managers, it's a trophy elk unit in southern Colorado in the San Luis Valley on the Trinchera Ranch, and they want to manage it for elk. So they want to have um, a lot of it's summer range, and so they want to have a lot of forage, so grasses, forbs, and a lot of woody vegetation, aspen, etc. And when we look at the rooting depths of a lot of the species that they're interested in, under a bank full conditions, the native grass forbs are in this upper foot and a half, and then aspen and cottonwood will get down about 4 feet. When we look at where our bank full elevations are, these rooting depths are well below where any of the moisture benefits are going to come from at bank full discharge. But for species like sagebrush, which while it's a very important species for elk winter range, on summer range it's not really utilized that much. It's got tap roots that can get down to about 8 feet, and it has no problem tapping into this existing soil moisture profile. So sagebrush has the competitive advantages, and the species that they're trying to manage for are at a disadvantage. Again, this is a picture that I had earlier. What we're going to look at is a paper that was put together by some guys named Clure and Thorne. And basically, what they're looking at is a channel evolution model. And they've come up with this concept of stage zero, where these low gradient settings should probably, rather than having a single thread channel in them, should be a braided multi-thread channel. And this is kind of an example of that sort of look. And you can see this little brighter green. This is the historic valley bottom. It's a low, gentle swale. When we get water onto this, it spreads out, it slows down, and we deposit a lot of material. But and so erosion is a natural feature, and these systems are going to change, and there's going to be downcutting. But ultimately, under natural conditions, according to Clure and Thorne, we should have this cycle that goes through these different stages and ultimately returns to stage zero. But what they found and what their hypothesis is that we can get locked into an alternative steady state that's degraded. And so we get some down cutting, and rather than it moving through this channel evolution process, it gets stuck in this loop where it cycles back and forth, just like we saw in that Spanish Gulch example. And here's an example on the same property where we see this deep head cutting. Water to get water onto the floodplain is going to take tremendous flows. Once we have those flows, we blow out all of our sediment and we continue this process of down cutting. So, what is low tech process based restoration? It is we focus primarily on systems that are 4 to 6 feet deep. We can work in deeper systems, but once we get between 6 and 10 feet, we have to start looking, rather than at hand-built structures, we start looking at equipment-built structures. But the idea is that we're going to use lots of small structures to restore lost ecosystem processes. And it's a no-regret strategy because while we have lots of small structures, if we have a single structure or a couple of structures that fail, the cumulative effect of that is very, very small. And so by spreading out our restoration strategy over a lot of structures and over time, what we can do is we can help these systems reset themselves. It's science-based, but it's also really, really easy to understand. It's highly intuitive. And with a little bit of experience, landowners can learn to do this on their own property and go through the process on their own. It's an ancient technology. There's examples of many similar structure types. Down here in the Four Corners area, if you go to Mesa Verde, you can actually see some of these things that are 800 to 1,000 years old. It's technology that's used throughout the world. And so it's a growing field, but it's also ancient. Why do we do it? Well, the why in restoring these lost ecosystem functions is to restore floodplains. We want to re-wet that sponge. We want to enhance groundwater recharge. And if we do it correctly, we can increase base flows and increase water availability, improve water quality. If we're interested in fisheries, etc., we can improve water temperatures for some of our native fish. From a vegetation production standpoint, we can increase grasses, forbs, and wetland species. This increases forage for livestock and wildlife. It improves drought resiliency. It's also very, very useful in post-fire rehabilitation. And as we seem to be having more and more range fires and forest fires, this can be a really, really important tool to keep those systems from blowing out after a fire. Again, it's a simple process. It requires us to think about how the systems that we're working in capture, store, and release water. So how do we know it's working? There's some really good studies that are coming out. Here in the Gunnison Basin, we've been doing wet meadow restoration since 2012. And one of the partners that we worked with is the kind of the science arm of the Nature Conservancy, and that's Colorado Natural Heritage Program. And they've put in over 500 transects in the basin, and they've been monitoring them since 2012. And in 2023, the lead researcher on this, Renee Rondeau, released a paper, and whoop, sorry. The metric that they were focused in is down here at the bottom. They wanted to see if we could improve facultative wet and wetland obligate species. And what we found is depending on how wet those systems were, or how dry they were, we saw a phenomenal response. In our drier systems, we saw an 85% increase in wetland species and almost a 40% increase in those systems that were still relatively wet. But even our forbs went up between 17 in the wetter sites and 28% in the drier sites. Our grass cover increased between 16 and 17%, and just overall total plant cover increased by roughly 25% when we average it out across both structure types. And this is an example that she used in her publication of a site and how it changed over a period of 4 years. This is just an example of a site on the Mountain Island Ranch outside of Grand Junction, where we were looking at these big head cuts in this meadow and how it's improved over a period of about 3 years in these photos. Another study that is emphasized by the sage-grouse initiative was by Silverman et al. And what they found, they looked at 3 different low-tech process-based restoration techniques: beaver dam analogs in Idaho, intensive riparian management in Maggie Creek, Nevada, and then the Gunnison Basin wet meadow process. And when they plotted out change over time, what they found was a relative rapid recovery rate of about 5 years with each one of these different techniques. And then it kind of plateaus, levels out. But what we get is even in the face of intensive droughts, we have drought resiliency. And so that 5-year recharge of water tables gives us about a 25% increase in productivity across all 3 different restoration technique types. And that productivity persists. And even in the face of increasing drought, we're seeing resiliency in these systems. I'm going to show you a short video. This is a USGS video on a property down in the Chiricahua Mountains in Arizona. It's a paired watershed study, and they were able to do some really unique things. It's about a 10-minute video, so I'm going to turn that on, and we'll watch that one.
The Chiricahua Mountains are a land of history, wilderness, and wonder in southeastern Arizona. But like many places, these mountains have been subject to intense pressure from westward expansion, climate change, and unsustainable land use practices. However, there is one watershed in the Chiricahuas that is deviating from this trend and showing evidence of remarkable restoration potential. A place where natural infrastructure and dryland streams are supporting adaptation to and protection from climate-related disturbances and stressors. This is Turkey Creek. Situated on the El Coronado Ranch, and it is an oasis in the Chiricahuas, maintaining water where it had been lost over time using nature-based solutions. Managed by Josiah Austin and Valaire Austin Clark from 1982 to 2022, its story has intrigued scientists for decades.
I remember the first time that I came here was in February 2013 with a large group of people. And we came through and we were all amazed at the land management that the Austins had done here, where they had created these ponds and swimming pools and bathtubs all up and down the forest lanes where they were harvesting water. And I could only think that the feeling that I got looking at these structures was completely indescribable because it was so powerful, the amount of earth that was being moved and the amount of water that was being harvested. And it was also indescribable related to my professional career because there was no metrics and there was no scientific quantification that described the mechanisms that were happening in the hydrology here. And that made me really excited about creating an experimental laboratory.
The extraordinary thing about this watershed is the sheer number of rock detention structures the Austins installed. Dr. Norman and her team were able to capture GPS data on over 2,000 structures And remarkably, that may be only a fraction of the total.
So my husband started building small dams to harvest the water and to control erosion. And when he did that, so the grasses stayed green during the dry season. And when I say a few dams, he built several thousand.
We were very lucky where we started putting these loose rock structures here at El Coronado. I put in one or two to protect a road. After we put it in that area, I noticed that the grass was greener on both sides of this. It was almost like a retention wall. And I thought, well, if it works here, let's put in a few more of them. So I put in a few more and I got instant results. After 20 years, we have 20,000 of these loose rock structures. If somebody had come to me and said, Joe Austin, what you need to do is put in 20,000 loose rock structures, I would say, you're crazy.
There is no other watershed in the United States that boasts this sheer number of structures, making it the perfect location to conduct studies on their impacts. And by comparing the data collected from an adjacent watershed, Rock Creek, where there are no check dams installed, the USGS was able to establish a paired watershed experiment to draw and compare quantifiable insights about how the water behaves and how the land responds in the presence and absence of rock detention structures. Using existing weather gauges to monitor rainfall or the input of water into the watersheds, the USGS established modified continuous slope area gauges in both streams to capture high-resolution data on how high the water rose and how fast it receded after a rain event. Continuously recording pressure transducers, crest stage gauges, and direct measurements of stream flow were used to develop stage-discharge relationships, while GPS surveys, terrestrial LiDAR, and three-dimensional models refined their knowledge of water yield and sediment loads over time. Additionally, soils were sampled to analyze their organic material using isotope analysis.
Now I'm standing in the Turkey Pen subwatershed. This is one of the tributaries of the Turkey Creek that we were just looking at. And this is one of the areas that the Austins had invested a lot of effort into slowing the water down. You can see here, these are small rock check dams that they put into this watershed. The water here is running pretty slowly. If you look down, you can see it's also very clear. So they're not very tall, but they stretch across the width of the channel. We don't see much incision here and very little exposed bedrock. Okay, now we're standing over in Rock Creek. This is the watershed that's just adjacent to the Turkey Pen watershed. You can see the water flowing here is flowing a little bit faster and it is flowing over rock. There's a lot of exposed bedrock here. The water flows through deep channels with large boulders and it flows much more rapidly and with higher turbidity. This is our control site in the paired watershed experiment that we did at El Coronado Ranch.
The results were in, and the data confirmed Dr. Norman's suspicions of the benefits of rock detention structures. The first result of the hydrologic discharge analysis showed the watershed treated with rock detention structures having a 50% reduced average rate of flow, mainly during flash flood events. In addition, the check dams were found to be extending the timing of summer base flows in the treated watershed by 3 to 4 weeks. The result that was maybe the most shocking was that there was 28% more water flowing downstream in the treated watershed when compared to the control watershed of Rock Creek. This goes against conventionally held beliefs that bare bedrock transports more water downstream. What the evidence portrays instead is that these rock detention structures are allowing more water to be kept in the system. Dr. Norman's team hypothesized that the check dams were creating perched water tables above bedrock. A calibrated soil and water model was applied to estimate the total soils stored by check dams throughout the watershed, and it found that they stored a little more than 200 tons per year. This erosion control around the check dams keeps the sediment out of the stream and increases downstream water quality. The results of the soil isotope analysis depicted the potential rate of carbon capture for rock detention structures at between 200 and 250 metric tons per hectare, which is equivalent to what is stored in coastal wetlands.
All of these rock detention structures are detaining the water. They're capturing the soil. They're capturing what's proven to be very rich, nutrient-rich soil. They're sequestering carbon, and they're allowing the water to stand still in these dirt sponges long enough so that the vegetation is able to take hold. And then the vegetation then acts on the same cycle, helping to delay the water and keep the sediment in place.
The USGS team's scientific approach to gathering data was able to verify the ecohydrologic benefits provided by restoring the landscape with rock detention structures. The data showed that these structures bring much needed water back into ecosystems, store carbon and sediment on par with coastal wetlands, support riparian habitat, reduce erosion, sediment yield, and flow intensity, and keep water in dryland streams longer than watersheds not treated with rock detention structures. This installation of and research on rock detention structures in the Turkey Pen watershed introduces low-tech and low-cost climate mitigation and adaptation strategies, paving the way for us to use natural infrastructure as a nature-based solution here in the Chiricahua Mountains and beyond. If you are interested in learning more, you can find links to the papers published from this research and other resources mentioned throughout the video in the video's description section.
So, obviously, in arid settings, if we can increase our discharge by almost 30%, we can extend our base flow periods for 3 to 4 weeks. I'm not sure that there's any of us that would turn that down. So, what are these low-tech structures that we're talking about? First thing when we think about these is how, one of the most frequent questions we get is where do we start? What do we need to do? And obviously, the first thing you want to look at is protecting what you already have. If we look at this example here, we see this really lush wet meadow, but then we see this really distinct head cut that's draining the wetland, and we've got about 18 inches in difference between where the water table is here and down here. And so stopping this head cut from cutting into this meadow would be one of our top priorities. Protecting what we have is always the best option because we can never restore as quickly and as effectively as protecting what already exists. So our top priority is protection. Stabilization is the next highest priority, and this is a structure that I'll talk about in more detail later on. But this is a road on BLM land, and during hunting season, the hunters are dragging their trailers through here, and it gets all boggy. So then they'd go over here, and then it'd get boggy, and they'd go down here. And so by building a porous structure that allows water to continue to move downstream, but provides a stable crossing for vehicles, we're able to protect and maintain discharge in this wet meadow. And then finally is restoration. Once we get water on the floodplain, we can use a variety of structures to spread that out. There are different categories. Obviously, we got stabilization and protection. We have grade control structures, flow dispersal structures, and behavioral structures. And I'll give you examples of each one. So stabilization, again, head cuts are our first priority. And everybody thinks about head cuts. We think about the mechanical motion of water eroding that soil. That water is dropping down here, it's speeding up, it hits the bottom, it undermines the face of this head cut, and then the head cut collapses and starts moving upstream. But there's another more insidious way that head cuts work, and even in the absence of water, they're migrating. Now, this is an example outside of Buffalo, Wyoming, on a project that we worked on, and you can see how the vegetation along this head cut is dying. And as this vegetation dies, the soil that's held by its roots is released. And this head cut, even in the absence of water, is moving at between 3 to 6 inches a year just at as the face of this head cut collapses. So what we're going to want to do when we protect these head cuts is not only are we want to break that velocity energy cycle, we want to mulch the face of this head cut. We want to keep this moist. The most simple head cut restoration technique we can use is a rock mulch or a rock rundown. We cut the slope back at 3 to 1. And in all of these structures, the most important layer that we're going to put in is a splash apron at the bottom. And that splash apron is going to be level with the channel bottom. And then we're going to shingle stack rocks back up into this. And then this is the second most important structure is this top one here. And you'll notice it's just below the level of the top of the channel up here at the top of the head cut. Now, if you think about as a kid, you'd roll rocks over and there'd be roly-polies and centipedes and all sorts of things underneath rocks. You'd always be wet under there. When we place rocks on soil like this, not only do the rocks provide surface roughness, but they also mulch that soil and they'll trap moisture in that head cut. Now, one caveat about these rock mulch, rock rundowns is these are to be used in low energy head cuts. These are these small peripheral head cuts that may be coming into a main channel. But if we put a structure like this in a high velocity area, these rocks will move. They're not keyed in. As we get into structures like that, we want rocks where we actually build a series of steps and the rocks are keyed together so that they won't move. So this is what we call a rock layback. And again, it's got a splash apron right here at the bottom that's level with the elevation of the channel at the bottom of the structure. And what happens is flow moves into here, it works its way through the structure and returns a sheet flow. And just so you know, I've given Mary all of this information. And so there's a whole bunch of PDFs that are available for you guys to use. And this comes out of the NRCS Colorado Technical Note. I think it's 40, but that's included in here. And all this information is available to you through Mary. The one structure that a lot of people are aware of is called the Zuni bowl. This is for these bigger head cuts like this. And basically it's a stepped bowl. And the idea is we're going to dissipate energy as it steps down each one of these layers. But we also build a pool at the bottom of the steps. And that pool collects water. Water falling into water is one of the best ways to absorb that energy that moving water has. And then as that water stills and we settle materials in the bowl, it then slips over or through the structure and begins to move downstream. In really big head cuts, we use what's called a log fabric structure. And that structure is created by excavating out the head cut, making it square. We lay in geotextile fabric, both lengthways and crossways, and then we butt the logs all the way up to the face of the head cut so that they're trapping moisture in there. Now, Bill Zedike, who designed the structure, he uses fence wire and staples. I use timber framing bolts because they lock the structure together better. And then as we get towards the upper layer, then we fold all that fabric over the top and then put in that last layer of logs. And so water coming down the structure will drop into this log structure and work its way down and gently work its way out. And the geotextile fabric will catch fine sediments. These structures are really important, but they have to be really, really well anchored. And then the next type of structure after stabilization are grade control structures. Once we've halted the head cut, what are ways that we can lift water within the channel? And the one that we see a lot is the one rock dam. Obviously, there's more than one rock in this dam, but what it means is it's one rock tall. In this one, you can see the splash apron, water's flowing over it, and all that energy is being dissipated along the face of the dam. Behind the dam, that water is moving really, really slowly, and it's settling sediment behind the dam. The important thing in this picture that I like about this picture is the center of the dam is lower than the edges of the dam. So when we have water moving through the structure, it's moving through the center of the structure rather than cutting around the structure. This is the same structure from the uphill side. You can see how the water's cloudier on the uphill side because that water is carrying sediment and that sediment is being deposited in this structure, and the water downstream is much clearer. We build these structures. We start again with the splash apron, and then we build them up. After we have our footers in, we build these layers of rocks until we get to that desired elevation. One of the things you can put the rocks, I'm going to go back to this first one. These are book stacking rocks where our rocks were not perfectly square and they were taller in this direction. So rather than having two layers of rocks, we just turned them on their edge and stack them vertically. And that's called book stacking. Or if you have larger rocks, you can lay them horizontally. When we look at them from above, we're not building them in the pools, we're building them in the riffles. So we find those little high spots, and we start our structures there. So we fill the pools behind the structures. And again, we want kind of a smile. If we're looking at it from downstream, looking upstream, we want a smile. We don't want it to be flat across there. If we make it flat, they'll cut around the edges of our structure. Another variation of that is called a filter dam. And basically, it's a similar type of construction, but it's got geotextile fabric incorporated into it. And it's a great way in really fine sediment systems of catching a lot of sediment. A media luna is another structure we use where we have channelized flow. We build this interlocked half moon shaped rock structure. The water comes into the structure, it works its way through the structure, and instead of continuing down in a channel, it's now returned to the floodplain as sheet flow. These are really, really useful where we have culverts. You can build them in two ways. You can build them horns up, or a smile, or horns down, or a frown. And so the smile will take channelized flow and return it as sheet flow. The horns down is a great way of taking sheet flow and putting it into a channel. Like I say, if we had a culvert in here, this is a way we could do we can do a restoration project upstream of the culvert and then collect that sheet flow channel through, put it into a single channel so it can pass through the culvert. And then on the downstream side, we collect that channelized flow and return it to sheet flow. So that's a very useful way of using the media luna. The other technique that we're now going to look at is flow dispersal. Once we have water on the floodplain, how do we get it back up onto how do we spread it out? And again, the media luna is one. This is a wicker weir, and a wicker weir is just a very short BDA. Beaver dam analogs can be really important structures. The problem I find is that we tend to build them too tall. We build these giant ponds, but the problem is the difference between a BDA or a beaver dam analog and a beaver dam is a beaver. Beavers sit there and mend these dams every day, and when we build a BDA, if we don't maintain them all the time, they fail. The lifespan of a BDA is about 3 years, but these lower wicker weirs can actually be much more resilient. And I'll show you an example. This is on a friend's place outside of Westcliff. When we were working, he had a small little reach that had been pretty degraded, and we built a series of structures. These are just 2-foot tall survey stakes, and we wove in pieces of willow that we got out of these willows here. We wove in rabbit brush. We built a couple of rock spillways, and about 6 weeks later, a flood came through this same area. I'm standing on the structure. My buddy is standing up here with a laser level, and this was how tall or how deep the flood came up onto the landscape. You can see how the rabbit brush is all pushed down. And that little tiny structure captured all of this sediment. that just those 2 foot tall stakes, because as the water came up and it's moving a lot of sediment, that sediment began to collect, and as that sediment got stored behind the structure got much stronger. And even though the water came up rapidly, the structure didn't fail because it didn't have the leverage of all of that water on its face pushing it over. And this is what it looks like today. You can still see a little, here's one, or these are 2 stakes that have kind of emerged over time, but this structure now has held back all of that sediment, and the water table has been lifted about 10 inches behind this structure. And now we're starting to get willow regeneration into the structure itself. We've modified that structure into what we call a rock core wicker weir, and that's where we take basically 2 parallel wicker weirs that are about 2 feet apart, and we put geotextile fabric inside of them, and then we line it with rocks. Now we key it into the banks so that water's not going to cut around it, and then we make sure that the center of the structure is lower than the sides of the structure. And those can be very, very effective structures. I mentioned the low water crossing. Again, the primary purpose of this is to make sure that people stay on the road. But this is, you saw the earlier photo and right when we installed that structure, and now this is about 6 weeks after that structure was installed. You can see how water spreads out through the structure. This is what the structure looks like from the NAPE imagery, and what we can see is that water is now, instead of being stuck in this single thread channel, the water encounters this structure and then spreads out across the entire bottom of the meadow, but we still have the ability to get trucks and trailers across the meadow without disturbing it. They're really easy to build. You just basically over excavate the site, lay in geotextile fabric, and then lay down 3 to 6 inch cobble. You can put another layer of geotextile fabric on top and put full road base and road surface on top of that if you want, or just in these 2-track roads, we can just do this single layer of rock. It's a very, very effective structure. It serves 2 purposes. It's behavioral. We control behavior by giving people a way to drive across it, but it also provides flow dispersal. Another really important behavioral structure is a drift fence. And in areas where we have water tanks, especially earth tanks, what we get is a lot of trailing up and down the flow of the channel. And as in this case, this is on the Mountain Island Ranch. This is elk traffic rather than livestock traffic, but it can happen with livestock as well. But the animals moving to and from water, they're going to take the path of least resistance. And what they create is a little mini ditch that collects water and begins to downcut. By putting short reaches of fences across the valley, the animals now get up on the side, and then they stay typically up on the sides as they travel. You can see this drift fence and another one here. So rather than the animals dropping back down, they stay up on the slope rather than in the valley bottom. You can build, these folks chose to go with the buck and rail style fence, but you can build just ordinary 3-wire fence, an H-brace on either end. And this is one here in the Gunnison Basin. And you can see this is about a year and a half after we built this. There's no longer a trail down the middle of the valley, and instead that trail goes along the outside. This very effective way of guiding livestock and wildlife around these critical wet meadows. What do we build these structures out of? Well, the short answer is almost anything. I wouldn't use car bodies, batteries, or tires, but you can build them out of rock, we can build them out of brick, or you can build them out of wood, or any combination thereof. And so I'm going to go through some different, these are one rock dams. Here's one built out of rock. Here's one built out of bricks, landscaping bricks. And here's one built out of wood. they all serve the same purpose. It really doesn't matter what we build them out of. What matters is putting them where they're important and understanding the limitations, right? Wood floats, we need to keep it really, really well anchored. But in places where you don't have a lot of rock and you got a lot of wood, use wood. In this case, this is the Thunder Basin. We didn't have rock or wood, so by the time we looked at what it would cost to bring in rock, it was cheaper to buy landscaping bricks and use them. So we used landscaping bricks. Here, whoops. Here are the rock Zuni bowl, a brick Zuni bowl, and a wood Zuni bowl. All three of these structures function the same way. They're built out of different materials based on what we have. Sometimes when you have a giant head cut like this, basically we're going to build a retaining wall along the face of it. So landscaping brick ends up being a really, really effective way of dealing with that head cut, that big long head cut. Vegetation is a great tool. This is a natural debris dam, and you can see it's holding back about 18 inches of sediment going upstream. And so we can mimic that. This is on a state wildlife here outside of Gunnison, and they were clearing juniper trees out of the riparian bottom. So we just took and stacked those juniper trees in the bottom. This is on the 28-hole ranch out up above Colorado National Monument outside of Grand Junction, and we were doing a pinyon juniper thinning project. And rather than doing lop and scatter, what we did is we utilized that material by putting it in, basically shingling it into these arroyos, and we're able to actually catch quite a bit of material. We had some monsoon flows that came in afterwards. A lot of the material moved, but it collected right here. And what you can see is all of a sudden, instead of the water flowing down this channel, it flowed up onto the banks, and it got up onto the old historic floodplain and soaked in up here. And it actually flowed further to the right than is in this photograph. But that vegetation, we graded this channel about 11 to 18 inches in a single flood event. So use vegetation where you have it. And you can use a combination. This is a hybrid. It's rock and logs. Really what's important is understanding why you're going to put the structure where you're going to put it. And so, I think there are, it's almost endless of what materials you can use. Maintenance. Maintenance is really, really critical, and I'm going to go back to, we have to remember water behaves in mathematically predictable ways. We have to be very cognizant of bank full discharge. And sometimes in a gully, it can be hard to predict. And here's a BDA that we built on the Mountain Island Ranch. We built this in July. This photograph was taken the following May. We have approximately 12 inches of sediment that's collected behind the structure. But the problem is, because we didn't key it into the bank, we made it flat rather than having a throat in the center of the structure. It started cutting around the structure. And when we went back in July to repair this structure, it had failed, and we lost all of the aggradation that we had above the dam. So we went in and we keyed back into the banks, and we lined this part with rocks, and we made sure that there's a throat, and that structure is now stable and solid. When we do this right, these systems change. You can see here, we don't have a lot of vegetation when this photo was taken, and this was the year after this structure was built. 2 years later, we have all this wild rose that has grown in behind the structure, and now the vegetation is working in conjunction with the structure, and we're seeing great progress. This was this meadow in 2020. This is what it looked like in 2022, and this is what it looks like in 2023. These structures need to have maintenance, but the rewards that we get out of that maintenance are visible in a relatively short period of time. It's important to go back more than just once. So this is a structure outside of, or a head cut outside of Buffalo, Wyoming. We went in and built this big structure, this nice big rock rundown. Um, and, I didn't really think about things. I didn't look at what was going on upstream. And I built this rock rundown in the first year. It looked great. The second year, it looked great. The problem was this was in the emergency spillway for a big stock dam upstream, and then we had some monsoon rains, and boom, the structure blew out. And so it's important to go out and then once you do have a failure, figure out why it failed. Well, I built a low energy structure in what ended up being a high energy setting. It didn't look like a high energy setting, but if I had actually walked and thought a little bit more, I would have realized that, oh gosh, that's where the spillway is, and we should have put in a Zuni bowl instead. This is a series of photos on another project outside of Buffalo that Lynn Sutphin with Pheasants Forever took. This is the day that she put this camera in. These are a series, we have a combination of this is a One Rock Dam, there's a Zuni Bowl right here, and then we have these wicker weirs with some rock rundowns and other structures. That night they had a huge range fire that came in, and the following morning this is what her structures looked like. Rather than panicking, she went right out and rebuilt those structures. And this is the following spring. Now, this is where the camera was, and I'm standing on the other side. Let me flip this picture up. So I'm standing right here when I took this picture. But because she went back in a single runoff, because we had so much ash and debris, and there was no vegetation to hold the soil, as soon as they had snow melt, all of these structures filled. This One Rock dam is full. This Zuni Bowl here is 2 feet deep at its deepest, and it filled completely in a single year. So yeah, each material type has its limitations, but if we're careful and if we go back and we maintain them, these structures can be very, very effective. So, with that, I want to say again, thank you for inviting me to speak, and I'd be happy to try and answer any questions that you guys have put into the chat, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Paul, thank you so much. You were so worried about being exactly on the right time, and you nailed that. It is 7:59, so your presentation was right where it needed to be. So, yeah, with that, we'll go ahead and we'll open up the chat this evening. So, if anybody has questions for Paul, we warned him that they aren't normally too outside of the realm, but hey, you know what? If we don't have any chat going, I might just ask Paul what his horoscope is this evening and get that conversation rolling. But Paul, we did have one that popped up, and it was that some of the types of structures that you were discussing, the individual is wondering how to take into consideration the change in habitat and the sort of unintended or expected impacts, like creating an environment for beavers and then managing that down the road.
Yeah. Whenever you start a project, you need to know what your objectives are. I think we can restore wet meadows so they become too wet for what our objectives are. So you really need to have clear objectives in mind. If you if you restore habitat for beaver and you don't want beaver, it can be a real problem. And so that's kind of what you want to do is really think about what your end objectives are. You still want to stabilize things. You can stabilize things with like a Zuni bowl or a head cut control structure that will protect the meadow that you have, and that's not necessarily going to raise the water table. But you're not going to lose the meadow that exists. And if you're worried about beaver colonizing into a restored stream, then maybe what you want to do is just protect what you do have.
So I'm going to go ahead and share a story here because one of our board members now has beaver dam analogs on his property. It's a tremendous property. It's got some of the northernmost sage-grouse leks in the United States. And he actually had a situation where he had seen some beaver damage to the property. And so he hired a trapper to come in to eliminate the beavers, thinking, this is high plains. I don't have any trees. I need to save these trees. And when the trappers came in, they caught some. But what actually happened was that they pushed the beavers a bit upstream. They dammed up ahead of his place and just turned off the faucet. And so now he has had crews coming in and building some of these beaver dam analogs to help to kind of, you know, fix that situation where they stepped into nature. Or, I obviously there are so many philosophical discussions that can be had about what we're trying to restore back to, but his fix ended up with some unintended consequences. And he was nice enough to kind of share that with us, and in hopes that other people would learn from his situation. And we did do a success story on that in 2024, I believe. So as we send out the thank you email to everybody tonight with all of the links from Paul, I'll go ahead and drop that in there as well, so you all can hear that story from him firsthand. And it kind of goes through and looks at some of the beaver dam analogs that he has put onto his place. So, Paul, with that, I do want to just discuss downstream impact, because that is always one of my major questions. I mean, water rights are huge. If we are blocking water and keeping it in our place, are we causing negative impact downstream?
And we've had we actually had legislation in Colorado passed specifically about that. Uh, and there's certain structures we're not supposed to build anymore, unless, well, I mean, you can build them, but water rights issues are really, really important. And it's, you know, the hard part is that in the short term, when you're refilling that sponge, that 5-year period, yes, there may be diminished flows downstream. The flip side is that once that sponge is refilled, like the video, the USGS video showed, you know, longer base flows, 28% more water, that actually will benefit people downstream. But it's really, yeah, you need to work with your neighbors. And I think the thing is, you know, we a lot of times our first reaction is let's go big and jump into this thing and change everything. And I think an approach that is probably better is to go in small and be very open about what we're doing and invite our neighbors to see what we're doing. I think if we focus on erosion control and things like that, I think we're much more likely to be able to do restoration on our piece without damaging folks downstream. But yes, I mean, you could literally shut water off for a period of time if you build them too big or too fast.
As I'm looking at the graphics or the images that you're showing us, and dealing with beaver dam analogs, that's something that I, at 5'4" and 140 pounds, can strategically think about implementing. But some of those rock structures that you're looking at, those require equipment, of course, but any of this requires manpower. So I
Yeah.
know in Montana, we've got some groups that are conservation minded that can come in and provide assistance. Are you familiar with those? Are there similar groups in Colorado? It seems to be something that people can get workhorses behind.
Yeah, and there are different ways of doing it. It's funny. In Colorado, we get a lot of volunteers and stuff like that, or we have youth conservation corps. Montana's conservation corps is a great program, and in fact, they can do the whole package of design and implementation. And it's a wonder. They've got crews that are just dedicated to that, so they're really good at what they do. They're really fast, they're very efficient, and they're very creative. But yeah, these are hand-built structures, and Bill Zedike kind of came up with this concept in New Mexico. He was working with a lot of the Native American tribes, and also with a lot of volunteer groups, and they didn't have a lot of money, but they had a lot of hands. And so, yeah, this is hands-on work. But again, it's the kind of thing that you don't have to do it all at once. And it's the kind of thing, it's like, well, I've got a couple of hours, I'm going to go build a couple of structures. And my friend in Westcliff, that's what he does. For him, it's just kind of it's part of the regular maintenance that, well, I'm going to walk the creek this afternoon, and he moves a couple of rocks that, to improve things anymore. And so it doesn't have to be big, but yeah, I mean, if you're going to try and do an entire, like that drainage that had Lynette's pictures came from, she had a contractor in there for almost a month building those structures. In Wyoming, they have a really hard time, especially building stuff in the Thunder Basin. There are no volunteer groups. And so Wyoming is working on developing a group of contractors to try and be able to spread that technology out. But in Montana, you guys have got the Conservation Corps, and those guys are really, really good.
And I did drop that link into the chat. They are somebody that we do partner with within the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance and can definitely vouch for the work ethic and the leadership there. So that is definitely a great group. Question here, is there some place we can get help in evaluating our landscape and identifying where these structures and what type of structure would be the most helpful?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you can hire people like me to do that, but the other thing too is some of the references that I've given you. If you go to the Quivira Coalition, they're online, and a bunch of the PDFs that you guys will have available after this are there. Bill Zedike has one of his books there is called "Let the Water Do the Work," and that's a really great book, and it's not super expensive. But it's a great book that allows you it teaches you how to read the landscape and try and figure out how to do these things. And again, start small, and if you've ever done flood irrigation, or as a kid, when the snow would melt in the playground, you guys would dam things up on the playground and play with water, or you have a creek in the property that you played in, and this is super intuitive stuff. And once you just get a little bit of knowledge, you can do a lot on your own. Yeah, I would recommend the Quivira Coalition. And then, if you have questions, again, Montana Conservation Corps, they do a lot of they do a lot of their own design work here in Colorado, and I think similar things are going on in Wyoming and Montana as this is becoming more and more well known. NRCS and folks like that can be a really useful link, and they can be a really all of the land management agencies that we work with are starting to pick this technology up as well, so they can help you out as well.
Paul, I have a good friend who's got a little boy who is 6 years old or so, and he always is building all of those dams and streams outside whenever the runoff comes so he can just direct it everywhere. And his dad always says that there's two kinds of men, the kind that like to play with water and the kind that lie about it. And so like works for women too. It's still there's just water, fire, there's just something satisfying about the elements that are just you have to watch and you have to play with it. So I'm curious, similarly, using those strategies to identify the areas to really look at for the best impact. But then also, do you have tips or advice on how to monitor success to
Mhm.
see the impact of that?
The easiest thing to do is take pictures, right? I mean, when you get done, and you can put a fence post down so you walk to the same place every time and take pictures. But pictures are worth 1,000 words, and the easiest way to do monitoring is pictures. But some people, if you want to, you can set out veg monitoring transects and measure that change. But I think pictures are really and the other thing too is you can paint marks on your dam and see how high that dam is filling over time. But the most important thing is going back out and looking.
I'm going to drop a link here. We just dropped a new podcast episode for the Ranch Stewards podcast today. And part of that, or the whole discussion, was talking about drones. But part of
Mhm.
that discussion was talking about aerial monitoring and being able to snap pictures of
Yeah.
the same location from overhead, as well as putting in an automated flight path so that that drone flies the same area on repeat, taking the same pictures. And Maida Napton, who is RSA's mapping specialist, discussed specifically using the drone to really look at that topography, identify areas where this might really work well, and then also using that for monitoring down the road.
Yeah. Yeah. And nape imagery is a great way over time. You can see changes in nape imagery. That the low water crossing that I had a picture of that came out of the NRCS, well, Department of Agricultural National Agricultural Inventory Program, I think is what.
Acronyms. It's all acronyms.
And I did put in the stuff that I'm sharing, there's a bunch of useful links, and in that is a connection to the nape imagery, so you can go back and look at that. And the nice thing is they fly that typically, I think every 2 years, something like that. But anyway, you can go back, and once you have structures in, you can go back and follow it that way as well.
Another question from the crowd here. You had the story about when you're walking along and you can just move a couple of rocks and kind of do maintenance on it that way. So if you are going to be moving a couple of rocks, the question is, do you put them perpendicular to create the slowdown of the water? What's the strategy to placement?
Again, depends on the structure type, what your goal is. Um, and for head cuts, things move, right? You would get frost heave, or you get that one cow that loves to walk up the drainage, and they're gonna move things, or you things move. So just rearranging things so that if you see something that shifts, packing it back in there. But yeah, as far as putting rocks across the stream, as long as you're staying below that bank full elevation, if we build a flat dam across the water, we're basically raising energy. We're storing energy in the system. And if it doesn't have a way to pass through that system, it's going to cut around it. A really useful tool that I use a lot, and this is also in the links that I've given you, is a USGS program called Stream Stats. And you can literally, for most waters anymore, what they have is they take all of the gauged data for streams in an area, and they've built these kind of predictive models, and they can give you projected stream geometries. And so you're able to, you can look at it and say, okay, my stream under ideal conditions should be 9 feet wide and a foot deep. That gives you an idea of the shape that your structures should be and the size that they should be. And as long as you're allowing that volume of water to pass, you should be okay. Obviously, you want to, you need to be careful that you're keying back into the bank and stuff like that. But if you think about when that water gets on the bank, you want it to spread out. You don't want it to cut around something. You want it to sheet out across that surface. And so using that stream stats bankful geometries as a guide is a really useful way of being able to estimate how big your structure should be. And then once you've built a few of them and you've had water run through it, you can say, oh yeah, that the model works, or it's a model and it's not perfect. It needs to be taller, it needs to be shorter.
Paul, we have had on our ranch, some of our trees in the creek bed have really started to die off, some older, larger trees. And it's ugly. It doesn't look pretty, to look at. But I also hypothesize that it's probably creating this natural way for that water to get slowed
Mhm.
down. Is that just deal with the ugly for a while and it's nature doing what it needs to?
Yeah. Yeah, and I did a workshop for Nature Conservancy in South Dakota, and the ranch that we visited. the rancher would actually, those trees that started to get ugly and stuff and fall over, he'd push them over and put them into some of his channels, and he had a tremendous amount of aggradation behind those. So it's material that you have, and yeah, if you can uh, if you're able to utilize it, yeah, use that as material.
Awesome. Well, I don't think we have any more questions tonight. We'll go ahead and say a last call for questions. If anybody does have something for Paul, did want to mention tonight as well the sponsors that have helped to bring this Rural Resilience series together this year. We've got First State Bank, VSEF Cattle Company, Stockman Bank, Darren Nordhagen, Bud and Sheila Walsh, AgriBest Feeds, Montana Livestock Ag Credit, Vents, the virtual fencing company, and Ag Spire. So thank you to those folks for helping to support not only this series, but RSA throughout the year. All right, Paul, it looks like you are off the hot seat. So Steve Kenyon is looking for your email address. Steve had also asked if we could get a link for the video that was in tonight's presentation. We'll go ahead and give the information, Paul, for your website and that link to that I'm sure has all your contact info in it.
Yeah, please do. And the video I sent you guys the video too, so you guys can either or link directly to the USGS there. But you guys do have that video.
Perfect. I think what Paul is saying is check your email. Mary's going to have all of the details for us, and she'll take care of it all. So, Paul, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us for session number 3 in this Rural Resilience series. Still one more session coming up for 2026. It's going to be on March 5th. We're talking about what the beef industry could learn from the sheep industry. And our presenter, Brent Rader, is the Montana State University Extension Sheep Specialist. This webinar series is 100% free, and there is still a chance for you to get signed up if you aren't already to take part in that webinar live. Just head on over to ranchstewards.org/events. And we did mention several times during this webinar a follow-up email that, of course, went to the folks that were involved in the webinar live. If you would like those resources, just hop on down to the show notes. We've got a list of those there. If ranching, conservation, and strong communities matter to you, you are in the right place. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and be part of a winning team for agriculture and working lands.